Thank you so much once again for your time, and I understand you are here to help us understand what's this new show going to be about, 1000 African Voices. Firstly, what inspired such a show?
Okay, my personal inspiration came from having, for the past 5 years, listened to so much American content. When it comes to the world of podcasting, Americans tend to do or produce a lot more than Africans. So I realized that I needed to find a different voice. But the more I searched for African content, the more I couldn't find anything at all. So I decided that if there is no content online, we'd rather create it ourselves. And that saw the birth of 1000 African Voices, where we attempt to break down the boundaries that divide our beautiful continent. So that's really what the inspiration for the show is.
So is this the reason you decided to name it 1000 African Voices, seeing that there's a lack of African content online?
Yeah, exactly that. And as for where the number 1000 came from, we figured that if we do one voice per week, it will take us 8 years to get to 1000. And suppose the name 1000 was catchy enough for us to go with that. But it doesn't mean that once we collect 1000 voices, we will stop. And when you keep in mind that Africa has got over 1 billion people, you can imagine how many recordings still await our recording.
So where are you going to get the content from? Who will be these 1000 African Voices? Any influential people, perhaps?
Yeah, so we started recording about 6 months ago. We've done to date about 20 voices. A few South Africans, if I can name a few, Ntsiki Mazwai was our first South African. Whether she's influential or not, we believe that she is in her own space. Then we had a Professor Adamu from Nigeria, who's just influential or just as influential in his own country. We've also continued to request for interviews from even heads of state, but we try and make sure that the show is not political at all. We want to talk about African stories from an African perspective, but not necessarily delving deeper into politics. So yeah, we do look for people that are influential, but for us, as long as you have a story, you're welcome to be part of our project. And as you'll hear when you listen to the show, every single person has a story to tell. Our role is to record and publish those stories.
I'm glad you touch on the stories. I was about to ask, what are some of the issues? What are some of the issues being discussed? What are you tackling? What
Okay.
African stories are being told?
We're not tackling any specific issue. What we're aiming for is to give a voice to people who have something to say. One of my favorite episodes that our listeners can look out for was a recording of Mr. Robert Katende. So Robert Katende is a Ugandan national. His life story was turned into a Hollywood movie, The Queen of Katwe. It's a movie about a guy who passes opportunities to be an engineer and goes on to rather focus his attention on training the kids, young kids in Kampala, kids who lived in slums, on the game of chess. And through that game, he managed to impart life skills on those kids. So Robert will come onto our show. He's going to talk about the reasons why he decided to do that, the reasons he sacrificed his own career to rather empower the young kids of Kampala. So that's a story, or that's one story. The Ntsiki Mazwai voice, there we talked more about arts within the South African and African context. So we then delve into that. So we don't have an agenda that we're pushing, but we rather go where the voice leads. So depending on the person that we're interviewing, we tend to go with that as a theme for an episode.
Okay. And when exactly can our listeners start hearing these 1000 Voices on Channel Africa?
On Channel Africa, the first episode will be on the 2nd of June. It's a Saturday. It will be 9 to 10 in the morning. The same show will be repeated the following day on Sunday between 11 and 12, as well as on Monday morning between 3 and 4 a.m. But obviously, if you log on to channelafrica.co.za and go into the podcast section, you can get all that content at any time of your choosing.
And you will be presenting this show, right?
Yes, so I'm the host and producer of the show. but it's a team of 4 people who work on the project. We have our sound engineer, Mr. Bandile Lukele, who handles all the sound stuff. Then we also have Jones Maleka, who's our head researcher, and the script writer on our show is Buitumelo Muneedi. So the reason we have a script writer is that as much as our guests have a story to tell, we also feel that it's our responsibility to present those stories in a manner that encourages our listeners to listen to it from an African storytelling perspective. And that's why we have Buitumelo on board.
And maybe I should have asked you this question earlier on, you who will be presenting this show. Just a brief background for our listeners. Who is Avhurengwi? What can you say to our listeners?
So my favorite response to that question comes from a recording we did with Nsiki Mazwai, and I asked her the same question, and her response was, Nsiki Mazwai hates that question. And it has stuck with me since the recording because I understood what she meant, that it's quite difficult to describe who we are. I think our role is to present ourselves and allow others to describe us from their own perspective. So the person that I am to you may be very different from the person that I am to the next person. As for my background, I'm a South African, 36 years old, studied geology, so I still practice as a geologist. But what I'm really passionate about is to see these artificial boundaries that divide Africa fall away, and I think the responsibility is incumbent upon us to do exactly that. So as to who I am, I was born in South Africa in a little place called Venda. At the time it was the Republic of Venda, until 1992 when it became or was reinstated again as part of the Republic of South Africa.
Okay. Now, you explained that there's no particular agenda being pushed for this show. You are basically giving a platform for people who have stories that they want to share. Now, a listener who will be hearing this interview and feels that they have a very interesting story that they would want to share, how do they go about?
Okay, so there are people that we have interviewed. So we did not ask them to come on, but they rather said they have a story that they want to share. And the latest interviewee that we had is a lady from Guinea who works in New York, the US of A. She felt that she needed to come onto the show and share her story. So what she does, she's a fashion mogul in the US, but she takes most of the proceeds back into Africa, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon in particular. So if there's someone out there who feels that they have a story, they can log on to channelafrica.co.za, or they can go onto the show's website, that's 1000AfricanVoices.com, and go to the contact section, or they can just send us an email on 1000AfricanVoices.com or 1000AfricanVoices@gmail.com.
Okay. Is there anything that you would like to add?
It's really to encourage people to listen to African stories being told by Africans from an African perspective. It's one thing to turn on, say, CNN or CNBC and have an African being interviewed by an outsider, so to speak. It's another thing to listen to an African talking to another African about things that they can both relate to. So for those who have an interest, a keen interest in getting a different perspective on the African continent, I will encourage those people to listen on to the show or listen to our show. I mean, this year saw movies such as the Wakanda Forever. I keep forgetting the name of the film. So it's time for the African Renaissance, and Channel Africa for me is the perfect platform to do a show on African matters, because it is time that Africa has and is given a voice to speak.
Okay, Avhurengwi, thank you so much for your time. I think we will leave it there for today.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you for the opportunity.